Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you today for this AMP 2022 workshop. I have to say it's really great to see people and to see their faces. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today and be able to be in a little different circumstances than the past. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker for this session, Dr. Sean Glenn, Vice Chair of Molecular Pathology, Clinical Director of Genomics, Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, and they wanted me to emphasize Buffalo, New York. So the weather's a little bit different in Buffalo right now than it is here. I just came from Salt Lake and a foot of snow, so it's a little bit different also. But we welcome you all here today. We hope you're enjoying the weather. Hope you enjoy this conference. So at this time, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Glenn and let him introduce and give his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Glenn.
Thank you for that introduction. That was great. And, I'm here to speak about some of the clonality assays we've been running, specifically around the development and implementation of a highly accurate and automated solution for reporting clonality. So really, I thought I'd give a very brief overview or background of Roswell Park and our impact on genomics. As some of you may know, we contributed to the first human genome project by providing the bacterial artificial chromosomes that were actually used for sequencing of that genome. And then, throughout the years, we've established a genomics facility, as many institutions have, a Center of Personalized Medicine. We then spun out OmniSeq Precision Medicine, which was a molecular diagnostic company that has now been acquired by LabCorp and is their flagship for solid tumor testing. And right now we're kind of working on an advanced molecular testing initiative. And this clonality assay, or the automation of this clonality assay and reporting, is key to that what we're trying to do in our laboratory. And really what that is kind of bring up complex testing, but also do it in a very rapid and quick way for reporting data. So, not to get into too much of an overview of B and T cell clonality, but obviously these gene rearrangements in B and T cells have great diversity, and identical rearrangements reflect a clonal population, and clonal testing identifies a homogeneous state. So in cancer, this is very important for monitoring, to see if there's a clonal expansion of a certain T cell or B cell milieu of a single clone. So really, in our laboratory, we use next generation sequencing. We feel that it's increasing the resolution. This is a slide to just show you that, we're targeting the IgH and Ig kappa for B cell, and for T cell, we're doing TCR beta and gamma. And like I had said, we're using MySeq sequencing is an NGS platform, and we really feel that reliability, reproducibility, and even sensitivity are pretty on point. But the next generation sequencing instrument, really allows for specific rearrangements to be identified at a sequencing level. We can look at clonal relationships, and obviously for recurrent disease and MRD, which was just discussed in the previous talk, it's very important to know the exact clone by which you're tracing. So also what's very nice about NGS is having an increased multiplexing capability. In my laboratory for the work that we do, we run B and T cell and even somatic hypermutation on the exact same plate. This is kind of just an example plate layout where we have all the targets along the bottom, the B cell and T cell targets. We run, a set of controls, a no template, a positive control, and an NTC, and that allows us to run, a series of samples across this plate and then sequence on the next generation sequencer. So really what I'm here to talk to you today about is some work we've done to automate the informatics solution or the analysis pipeline, but I wanted to kind of give you, a litmus test of some of the samples that we used and some of the data that we got to integrate into showing that we have a feasibility to actually run the assay and then also report it through this automated process. So we took a bunch of gold standard samples where we had Sanger or CE results. For B cell, we had 36, where 25 were clonal. And for T cell, we had 31, with 21 of those being clonal. We looked at bone marrow samples, blood, and of course FFPE, because these are the type of samples that we see in our laboratory. And like I had mentioned previously, we were looking at IgH and Ig kappa for B cell and beta and gamma for T cell. So for our pre and analytical studies, there was a few things that we wanted to kind of test out when using next generation sequencing. And we really wanted to focus on nucleic acid stability. So we had some samples that we had, some high quality DNA from blood or bone marrow and matched FFPE samples from that same group. And we also wanted to look at some of the analytical studies, which included, the variability of DNA that you can put into the assay, the size or batch size of the number of samples or number of targets you're running per run, library input amount after you generate the library and quantitate the library, linearity, and of course, accuracy against that gold standard data set that I had previously told you about. So really, if we jump right in, because I don't want to spend too much time on the actual data, I want to get into the pipeline part of this talk, we really wanted to show that we could take the same samples, whether they're FFPE or blood, from the same specimen and actually get the same result. And, I think it's very important. This is just a very small subset of the data. But, what we're trying to show here is that, these clonality results are accurate, whether you're using FFPE, which is highly degraded material, or DNA that's highly degraded, when you compare it to the blood and bone marrow from the exact same specimen or exact same sample. I think it's very important because in the real world, you don't always get high quality DNA. So you have to make sure that your assay performs very strongly when using degraded material. And, this included very specific targets for all the different amplicons that we were using when we looked at the sequence data. So the next evaluation we wanted to do was around DNA input. And so what we did is we ran, a large series of samples, across our entire assays. And we just looked, at the more important things that are boxed here in red around, what our, average reads across all the assays and the average reads for FFPE and blood and bone marrow. And really, if you look at the data, 100 nanograms seemed to be a sweet spot when it came to the number of reads. I mean, obviously 200 nanograms probably had a little bit more reads, but we felt that, that the 100 nanogram was a good barometer. So that's where we stuck with, and we decided to run our assay at 100 nanograms for each of the targets. At the bottom of this panel, you see failed assays, and another reflection of using 100 nanogram instead of 200 nanogram was we had two of the assays fail at the 100 nanogram level and at the 200 nanogram level, so we weren't really gaining anything by running more DNA. So we decided to stick with the 100 nanogram input. So we know we get enough abundant reads, and we had comparable failures to that 200 nanogram input, which is very important to have as minimal failures as possible. So another thing that's really important in a lab is to make sure that you have different batch sizes, because sometimes you might only have a few samples or you might have a lot of samples. And the way we run our assay, like I had mentioned, we like to run all the targets all at the same time. Specific to our lab, we usually see we're either running about 6 samples or we're running 12 samples plus control. So those are the batch sizes we used. I'm sure we could have gone on the higher end and the lower end, but this is a comfortable number for what's happening in our laboratory. So as you can see here, there really isn't too much deviation around batch size. One would expect, and as you can see, the less samples and targets you run, you get much higher average read counts. In this case, double, if you look at the red highlighted box. And the number of assays that did not qualify, which we used 20,000 reads to qualify something as passing, was fairly similar. We had one more failure in the batch size of 12, but that's not a really significant change in the number of samples that are failing. So we feel confident running, at least in our lab, either 6 or 12 samples at a time on the MiSeq. So another thing that was very interesting to us when we were running some of our large numbers of samples was what did our library yields look like? And it tended to seem like there were a lot of assays that were less than 4 nanomolar. In this case, you see there's about 64, where ones that are greater than 4 nanomolar were almost 500. So it's about 10%, a little bit more than 10%. And what we really saw was that whenever we tried to sequence those 4 nanomolar pools, even though we weren't doing it by balancing them equal molar in the solution or into the final sequencing pool, we were adding them by volume to kind of increase the number of molecules that were in that sample. They still did not perform overly well. So we don't know really if this is associated, as you can see, of the 67 that we ran that were less than 4 nanomole, only 3 of them passed, with 64 of them failing. So that's a pretty high failure rate, where we had less than a 4% or less than a 5% failure rate when we had greater than 4 nanomolar. So, this is kind of something that we consider when we look at the material. I'm not going to say we don't run libraries that are less than 4 nanomolar. We definitely do that because they may work, at a very small percentage. But it was just something that we're cognizant of, especially when we're trying to evaluate QC in the lab. Really, we don't like to see, if we see a lot of libraries in the same experiment failing, obviously we think there might be a technical limitation or something happened during the processing of those samples. So really, another thing that we like to do is linearity studies, where we take standard controls that you can purchase off the shelf and do serial dilutions to understand how they perform. And really, this is just a representative graphs of the different targets that we use in our assay. And really, all we're trying to say is the percent reads for our rank 1 clones, or the first clone, the highest clone that we identify using NGS, has a linear relationship with the percent neoplastic cells, because we're assuming that serial dilution is related in some fashion to what you would expect in a neoplastic cell, or the number of neoplastic cells. That may not overtly be an exact correlation, because these are synthetic, and they're not, we're not truly diluting cells. We're diluting, DNA, synthetic DNA or artificial DNA from, that can be purchased. And then, really the last part that we like to do around understanding or qualifying an assay is reproducibility. We want to run the same samples over and over again, and that includes run controls. So every, like I had mentioned before, every run we run, we always run a negative control, a positive control, and an NTC, and we like to look at the kinetics of those across many different runs. We also like to look at intra-run variants, where we take the exact same samples and we run them on the exact same flow cell, and do the exact same library prep all at the same time to see how they perform when they're all run as a batch. And then we also like to look at variation of intra-run, which is when we take the same exact samples and run them on different days with different technologists, with different libraries or different library kits or different barcodes, to see that those kind of variations don't impact our ability to get results. So really quickly, I just wanted to kind of go over some of the data that we have. When it comes to positive controls, you can see that across all our targets, our average reads are extremely high. That's the top red box on this table. And there's not really, that being the average reads, we get a pretty good high level of reads, where our cutoff's 20,000. So these are 10 times or even 15 times that number. And really, we get a good tight standard deviation for the number of reads that we were expecting. I think also very important is that, there's a very low standard deviation. So if you look at that red box, that these are supposed to be positive, which means they should be greater than 2.5%, for FR1 and across. And I think what we really see is that the standard deviations are pretty tight. So in this situation, we really like to look at the standard deviation of the positive controls when it comes to the results. And they look fairly tight to us. So, obviously the positive control performs, very well in this assay, which is a commercial control that you can purchase. This is true of the NTC as well. We get a very good number of reads. And again, this assay should be negative. So if you look at the average reads of the rank 1, you can definitely see that they're below our 2.5% cutoff. So this shows that our negative control is in fact doing its job and showing that the assay is negative these assays are negative for this sample. I think for the NTC, it's very important to run an NTC to look for any cross-contamination or inherent contamination you might have in your laboratory. And again, 20,000 reads is our minimum number of reads for each target. So here we're kind of just showing that, the max reads plus 1 standard deviation, which is kind of how we do things in the laboratory, is really indicative that we're not getting a lot of reads in our NTC, which is good. It shows that the lab is clean and we're not cross-contaminating with other features or other samples. And so this is something we also monitor very heavily when we run clonality. So really, just to get into some of the intra and inter-run variances, these are kind of difficult to display, but essentially what we do is we run triplicates of a number of samples across all the targets. So on the left, you have a sample that's designated sample 24. You see the assay or the target in the next column, and then the replicate by which they're run. And really, if you just look across this, there's super high correlation to the clonality or no evidence of clonality calls, as well as, if it says no call, it means that we didn't run it for that specific assay because we didn't have data from our previous gold standard data set. But there's, high correlation, not just, at calling something clonal or having no evidence of clonality, but if you go and look actually at, the key clonal rearrangements that are present, they're highly accurate and highly reproducibility. And this is, I apologize, this slide's a little bit busy, but that's true also of intra-run variants. So, if we take the same samples and run them on different days with different technicians or laboratory technicians in the lab, or we use different reagent lots or barcodes or even different sequencers, we show really perfect correlation. The only time that, if you look at this very closely, I tried to highlight some of the clonal events to show the reproducibility across the targets in each of the samples. But, sometimes we do see a little bit of failures that may not always have good correlation. Like you might see one of your replicates fail, but the other one pass. And really, that could be just a borderline sample that gives us some trouble. So, for the most part, we've developed all these ways of looking across our data sets and our samples to make sure that we have a highly functional and highly reproducible assay. And then really what that helps us do is define a rule set. So what we wanted to do is define a distinct rule set for clonality and a polyclonal background. So the way our assay works, or the way that we've kind of developed our assay and then automated it, is we really didn't want to just have rules that could be flexed or bent depending on the day or depending on who's like looking at the data. And we set a discrete rule that not only do you have to show a clonal event, but you have to show a polyclonal background in this event. So for B cell, we have that greater than 20,000 reads, and we say that the top 2 clones have to be greater than 30%. If the top 3 clones, if the top 3 clones, which are ranked, which are the clones from 3 to 10, have to be less than 1%, meaning so clones 3 through 10 that are in your top 10 clones, I apologize, a little confusing, have to be less than 1% to define a polyclonal background. So it's not enough for something to be 30%, but it also has to have this polyclonal background. The top 2 clones also have to be 10 times the polyclonal background, which has to be greater than 2.5%. So really what we do is we have rule 1, if you're greater than 30%, you're clonal. But for this intermediate area or this intermediate range, you not only have to have a polyclonal background, but you also have to be 10 times that polyclonal background and have to be greater than 2.5%. And that would be clonal. If you don't have any of these, if you don't hit these 2 rule sets, then you're going to be considered negative, or what we call no evidence of clonality in our assay. And so for T cell, it's a little bit similar, but the requirements are slightly different. Again, we need those 20,000 reads. But the top 2 clones need to be greater than 50%. And if this happens, we consider the sample clonal. If that is not the case, we then look for the polyclonal background. And here, it's slightly different. You need 3 clones from the 3 to 10 ranks to be less than 1.25% instead of 1% like we saw in B cell. And that would define your polyclonal background. So if you had a lot of those, 3 through 10 ranks being at 5, 10, 12%, we don't define that as a polyclonal background, and we consider that noise. Thereby, the top 2 clones have to be 10 times the polyclonal background with greater than 5% of the, with a sum of greater than 5% to be clonal. So not only do you have to have greater than 5%, but you also have to be 10 times that polyclonal background that we defined. And again, if you don't hit these 2 rule sets, you would be considered to have no evidence of clonality. IGH is a little bit more diverse, so that's why the rules are a little stringent. They're at 30%, not 50%. They're at 1%, not 1.25%. This is how we precisely define a polyclonal background. And really what it helps, if you look at this table on the right, is, we're trying to understand and identify that restricted repertoire where you might see an increase in some clonal events, you might see an increase in number of cells, but there could be a smattering or a mixture of other, other clones that are coming up, and we don't really feel that can be considered clonal when we're looking at them. So once we built these rules, we kind of wanted to look at, that large cohort or that cohort of specimens that we had after we did all the litmus testing of how the assay performs. And really, we just looked at a couple other different pipelines that are published in the literature, including in vivo scribes. And really what we showed is for B cell, we have a greater sensitivity. We have 100% sensitivity in these gold standard samples where we had CE data that we could compare to. And in T cell, we did see an increase in our overall sensitivity, but underlined there in yellow, you can see that kind of our specificity drops. So we started to see some false positives sneaking up because maybe our rules were a little bit lax, and we're still continually developing this and looking at this as we have more and more data. So as we get more and more samples run, so we have an increased sensitivity, and really, once we did that and we felt that these rules were good in our laboratory, the next steps were really to automate the objective criteria so that these rules are hardened rules and we want them to be automated so we don't have to do a manual review process every time we run the assay. So really, that's kind of what's described here is, did the assay work? Did the controls pass? What's the clonality data look like? This used to be an individual really doing an in-depth data review, using cumbersome software or time-consuming review with Excel sheets, which, there can be, copy and paste errors and different things in the lab. And the data is, using the data could then be reported out. But what we've tried to do is by automating these rules, the computer or the software or the Docker or whatever you want to call it knows what the rules is. The data comes in, it can interpret that and specifically report out that automated result in less than 5 days. So that's, another key thing that I really didn't touch on was not only is it important to have this, strict rule set to help you define your clonality, but it also helps speed up the process because it can be fully automated, and when the sequencer stops running, the FASTQ files can be pushed automatically into the software, and the software can do its analysis. And I get a text message on my phone saying, hey, data is ready to be reviewed, and then I can just look at it and have my data available. So really, the first step, like we kind of described, was we really want to understand the run and control data. So this is kind of just a diagram of what we look at in the yes/no scenarios to make sure we understand what a passing run is or what a failing run is. Really, on this thing, the only sequencing control we look at is the Q30 has to be greater than 70. If that happens and it's a yes, we then go and evaluate our controls. We have all those metrics that we use that I described. They're also true to the positive control. And as you walk across this center bar, you can see that, if they're yeses, they go on to the next step, to see, did the positive control have enough reads? Is it clonal? Did it have the correct, VJ and length? Did it, if those are all yes, it then goes and evaluates the negative control. So the happy path, from positive and negative controls passing, then just goes into the controls pass in the bottom right corner, and then we can go on to sample review. There's a few different not so happy paths, as you can see in this flow diagram, that can lead to possible contamination or possible repeat of the sequencing run or possible repeat of samples that are evaluated automatically by our informatics solution. And then really, this is true once you get past all that QC data for the controls and the run level metrics. We then look at the B cell clonality rules, which we just went over. And we know if it's less than 20,000, it goes to an invalid state, which could mean a rerun, or it could be that there was a paucity of cells that were not B cells. And then which we can review in our laboratory, but also we can, go through and make sure that all these different rules get us to a clonal state or a no evidence of clonality state, which are all, pointed out by this different little highway infrastructure that we have that is within our automated Docker. The same is true for T cells, except like, I had mentioned the rules are slightly different, but you're either invalid or you either make it through, past the QC of the 20,000 reads, and then you get pushed through becoming either, having no evidence of clonality or becoming a clonal for reporting. And then really, this is kind of, this is a very simplified version of what we had to do to code and bring all the infrastructure together. In the top left corner, we have a LIMS management system that allows us to track our samples. The technologists know what samples have to be run. They understand the timelines and when things come in the prioritization. On the bottom right-hand corner, we have where the data is actually created and brought into this analysis and report generation infrastructure. And then we have sample information integration in the top right and the final output where all that has to come together. The sample and the data and any identifiers that are required for that sample through our LIMS system are all put into this Dockerized version that can then be spit out into a formalized result that we can share with investigators. And really, that's my last stop. So my last slide. So I'd like to thank the Department of Pathology. Dr. Carl Morrison's our chair, and he's my supervisor, as well as these other folks listed. And I'd like to thank InVivoScribe for having me. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, great. Yeah, one right here, Parth.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It's very informative. Kristen Champion from Quest Diagnostics. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage your repeat and invalids? What % do you see that falling into? How do you manage those? Do you repeat if another target's positive? Do you have rules for repeating?
Yeah, we do have specific rules, for. It absolutely depends on the specimen type. So for FFPE, we do tend to see a little bit higher number of invalids for the FR1 because it's a little bit longer of a amplicon. But we call clonality, I kind of glazed over it. If any of the IGH amplicons, FR1, 2, or 3 are positive, we automatically call that clonal as long as it hits our rule set. So, FFPE sometimes struggles with FR1, so that's probably where we see a lot of our invalids. But globally, having an invalid FFPE specimen is very rare because you have you have FR2 and FR3 that can pick those up. I think that on the bone marrow or blood side, it's a little bit different because we tend to get a lot of invalids, and then when we go back and look at the samples, it's because they did not have B or T cell, an increase in B or T cells. They were very scant or very low level, so we wouldn't expect them to work anyway. So we usually, have a conversation with the investigator about that, and they realize that maybe the test shouldn't have been ordered, or it's not the appropriate disease. I mean, a lot of the things that we're doing in our laboratory, we tend to even be ahead of those types of evaluations. Like we can get the sequencing data. Sequencing data is becoming so robust and fast that we can sometimes get that data ahead of them even knowing that kind of information, that they might get by flow cytometry.
What happens when FR2 and FR3 are negative and FR1 is inadequate?
That's a great question, and it was part of one of the flow diagrams that would be considered invalid in our
Invalid.
Yes, because for something to be truly negative, we would expect all three to function. But I think the scenario of one of them being clonal tends to happen more than having negatives. But you're right, that would definitely be an invalid.
Wouldn't you just use your kappa result? Sufficient.
What do you mean by kappa?
You don't have
Well, yeah. I mean, we do run kappa,
If
but
kappa's positive?
well, yes. So if kappa is positive, we would say positive. You're absolutely right.
But if kappa is also negative,
Then it would be invalid, and that's correct.
all 4 have to work in order to make a call.
for a negative call, yes. But anytime one of them's positive, that would automatically reflect to a positive. Yeah. Seems pretty commonsensical, doesn't it? Like, I mean, like it's a workflow, right? Okay, thank you very much.